We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We continue our conversation with Liberty Nation's economics editor and guru, Andrew Moran. Andrew, thanks for sticking around. So just before we went to break, we were talking about the what other countries are doing in response to Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. And we mentioned that there's reports that around 50 different countries at that point by last weekend had already made the phone call to try and figure out what they can do. Now, do you want to give us a bit of a play-by-play by what you're seeing in terms of what countries are doing in response?
Okay. Just before we go to that, I'd like to make a point that you made prior to commercial break. We're talking about tariff revenue. That's assuming that nothing changes in international trade. The other countries don't respond to, let's say there's an economic slowdown driven by the tariffs. So if let's say you go by Peter Navarro's estimate of $6 trillion over 10 years, that's just assuming that nothing changes at all. Now, when it comes to other countries, what they're saying, I don't know why all of a sudden we believe what government is saying, what an administration is saying. We just went through 4 years of not really believing what anyone is saying from the 600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, let's just assume, yes, that other countries want to come to Trump and talk. Now, what everyone is saying so far, whether it's Vietnam, Zimbabwe, I'll touch upon that shortly, is that they're gonna lower their tariffs. But once again, as to my previous point, it's just what everyone is saying. It's more than just non-tariff, more than just tariffs, about all the other trade restrictions. Now, fine. Let's say Zimbabwe. They say we're gonna slash our tariff rates to zero.
Yeah, Zimbabwe, that vital partner of U.S. interests. Yes,
that's my point exactly. Yeah. They import what, $45 million a year in U.S. goods. That's a drop in the bucket. That's not going to transform international trade. It's not going to eliminate America's trade deficit. And that's another thing too. The President Trump and his administration, they focus a lot on the trade deficit, which is about $1 trillion. Jameson Greer, he's the U.S. Trade Representative. During his confirmation hearing, he was talking about how the trade deficit is the number one threat to U.S. economic and national security. Now, fine, you target that $1 trillion, but then you're eliminating about $10 trillion in value, considering what happened in the financial markets over the past week. So that's quite a trade-off you're doing. You're trying to eliminate $1 trillion deficit at the risk of eliminating $10 trillion.
Who was it who said is recent? Somebody said the stock market is a long-term.
Yes. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was saying he was paraphrasing Warren Buffett, who said that in the short term the markets are a voting machine, and in the long term it's an indicator of the economy.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting thought about it, because what we're seeing some massive drops, some bounce backs, some might say dead cat bounces, but we're seeing this volatility. But overall, things are still trending upwards, because that's what the stock market essentially does. I can't see it dropping to, let's say, those days of old black and white when dinosaurs roamed the earth of 2020, when when the stock market was where it was, and now we're talking. We have people saying that it's another. Well, actually, I probably shouldn't quote this particular person saying there's another Black Monday coming, because that was Jim Cramer. So it's kind of the anti-prognosticator there. But I mean, markets work long term. That's the point of them. You've got people making money on day-to-day trades, but how do you think the long-term prospects for the stock market is? I mean, it'll eventually recover as things settle in, won't it?
So the financial markets are still signaling volatility. What I'm most interested in monitoring is the Treasury yield market. So if you look at the Treasury yields, the 10-year yield, it fell toward 4%, dipped slightly below, but it hasn't cratered as you would expect, because if everyone is prognosticating a massive recession, or some saying depression, stagflation, whatever negative or adverse economic reality that could come out of these tariffs, the 10-year yield has not crashed. And as you and I have discussed before, and I recently wrote on LibertyNation.com, that's one of the objectives of the White House, is to lower the 10-year yield, because yes, it lowers borrowing costs for consumers whether you're borrowing money for a house or a car. But with about $5 to $9 trillion of debt that needs to be refinanced this year, if you lower that 10-year yield, the taxpayer is going to save more money because you have lower interest costs. So the treasury
Yeah.
market is something that you should be monitoring in this environment.
Yeah, it's proving surprisingly resilient at the moment, and that is actually something I want to get into because it's 2025, so there's $9.5 trillion of US debt that needs refinancing as soon as possible. Now, under the and I think we should probably break this down just because not everybody's dialed entirely into this, but if the 10-year Treasury yields go down, there's a good chance that the Fed will follow with a rate cut. If there's a rate cut, that means that the US and consumers can borrow for much cheaper. Now that 9.5 trillion in US debt that needs refinancing, if the government can get that refinanced at as close to zero as possible, that's an automatic saving of well trillions of dollars, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That would be huge. If the administration can accomplish that, then Trump should be on Mount Rushmore if he could accomplish that. And then if that is a big if the federal
Yes, of
government
course.
can actually slash spending to, let's say, even pre-pandemic levels, then you could possibly look at balancing the situation. Because Scott Bessent, he's been a good job cheerleading the
Sure.
administration's efforts and the overall government's efforts of trying to find waste, fraud, abuse, blah blah blah, and cut spending because the U.S. according to him, the U.S. is going to avert a financial crisis if you can do that. Now, of course, everyone in mainstream media is avoiding that part of it of the discussion, but that's really the reality of the situation. Is that if the government can get yields down and try to slash spending to pre-pandemic levels, the U.S. is on a much, I would say, I'm not going to say sustainable path, but a much improved situation. Now, what the Federal Reserve, however, the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, if you look at his comments, the Fed isn't ready to slash interest rates according to what he's saying. You
Sure.
look at these summary of economic projections, and most of what the Fed they're not expecting 2 rate cuts this year, based on some comments. Let's say Raphael Bostic, he's the Atlanta Fed chief. He said that he's only expecting 1 rate cut this year. So they're still trying to digest the quote net effect of all the changes, policy changes from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think what we're witnessing is Trump's response to the Fed's refusal to get on board with lowering interest rates. Because, I mean, Trump wants a short-term win that can be pointed to for future, I guess, America first politicians. They can say, look, Donald Trump did this, it worked, it's still in place. And as they look out over his Mount Rushmore figure, they'll have to add a bit of extra rock up the top for his hair, just to keep it all in there. But they want something that they can point to and say, look, this worked because Donald Trump forced the Fed to do this. And I mean, I might have this entirely wrong, but it seems to me that if the Fed's still being reluctant to say we're gonna cut this, even down to, let's say, as you say, pre-pandemic levels, what was that, like 0.25% or something, a quarter point or something in
The
2020?
deficit to GDP ratio. Is that what you're saying?
No,
Sorry.
the interest rates.
Oh, at the pandemic. Oh, pre-pandemic. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1.75% was the last interest rate before the pandemic.
So even if you can get down to that, that's it. I can't do the math in my head, but that's at least a couple of trillion savings long term off the debt.
Okay.
So I'm wondering how many levers Donald Trump's going to use and what other levers he has in his toolkit to try and force that reality.
Okay, so now the Federal Reserve, it's in a balancing act situation
Sure.
because Jerome Powell, he recently said that the tariffs could lead to persistent inflation. So, with one of the objectives of the key, one of the dual mandates of the Fed is to have price stability. Now, if you're having persistent inflation,
If I may point out, Andrew, the last 4 years have proven it rather ineffective at that.
of what the Fed has been saying.
Yeah, price
Okay.
stability.
All right. Yeah. Well, regardless of what the horrible track record of the Fed, that's
Sure.
one of the mandates of the Fed. But at the same time, if you're having a slowdown from the tariffs, then the natural response based on the last 100 years is for the Federal Reserve to slash interest rates. So it's a real balancing act. And I can't say I hate myself for saying this, but you have to sympathize with the U.S. Central Bank because it's going to be hard to fire that trigger of whether you're going to have consistent policy restraint or easing policy, which could revive the inflation threat.
Well, that's very quickly before we move on to our next segment, Andrew. I do want to 30 seconds touch on inflation. It
Go for
seems that we'll delve into inflation a little bit deeper as we go on, but just inflation currently as it stands, it looks like it's at a fairly manageable level, doesn't it?
The headline annual inflation rate based on the consumer price index is about 2.6%.
2.6%, which if that remains stable, sh should keep prices down, even though the tariffs will be putting up prices on other imported goods. Is that about right?
Well, the economic literature will say that tariffs will lead to a one-time price adjustment, but there's just still so much uncertainty surrounding trade policy that you have no clue if it's going to be if it's persistent or just a one-time inflation jump.
And of course, it could always be sticky. But we'll be back with Andrew Moran after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.